Most people assume the Opium Wars were fundamentally about drugs, a simple story of British dealers pushing narcotics on helpless Chinese addicts. Open any textbook, and that is roughly what you will find. Britain grew opium in India, smuggled it into China. China tried to stop it. Britain sent warships. Case closed. Good guys, bad guys. It becomes a straightforward morality tale. And that is the version that sticks because it is emotionally satisfying. It is also dangerously incomplete because the real story of the Opium Wars is not really about opium at all. It is about tea. It is about silver. It is about a collision between two civilizations that each believed with absolute conviction that they were the center of the world. And the consequences of that collision did not just reshape China or Britain. They rewired the entire architecture of global trade, finance, and imperial power for the next 2 centuries. The echoes of this conflict are still reverberating right now in boardrooms and parliaments and the tensions between Beijing and Washington. So if you want to understand why the world looks the way it does today, you need to understand what actually started these wars. Not the version you were taught, but the full, uncomfortable truth. Let us begin with the thing that made everything else inevitable, and that is Britain's addiction. Not China's dependence on opium, but Britain's extraordinary dependence on tea. By the late 1700s, tea had become the lifeblood of the British Empire. Tea was no longer merely a luxury. It had become a necessity. Workers in the factories of the Industrial Revolution drank tea to stay awake during 14-hour shifts. Soldiers drank it, sailors drank it, aristocrats drank it. The entire social fabric of Britain was organized in part around the ritual of tea, and virtually all of that tea came from one place, China. By the late 18th century, Britain was importing close to 7,000 tons of tea from China every single year. The British government slapped a 100% tax on those imports, which meant that tea was not just a cultural staple. It was a massive source of government revenue. The Exchequer depended on it. The East India Company depended on it. The entire imperial economy was tangled up in this one product from the other side of the planet. Now here is where the problem begins, and this is the part that most historical accounts gloss over far too quickly. China had remarkably little interest in what Britain wanted to sell. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful empire in Europe, the engine room of the Industrial Revolution, the country that was conquering half the known world, and the Chinese looked at everything Britain could produce and said, no thank you. Silk, porcelain, lacquerware, tea, China was exporting all of these incredibly desirable goods, and British manufactured products, woolens, tin, lead, none of it interested the Chinese market. The Qing dynasty operated from a worldview that was fundamentally different from the European one. They called themselves the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization. In their eyes, foreign nations were not trading partners. They were tributaries, lesser states who came bearing gifts and received the emperor's gracious permission to conduct limited commerce. This was not arrogance born from ignorance. At the time, it was a position backed by genuine economic strength. China's gross domestic product in the 18th century was arguably the largest in the world. They had a sophisticated economy, advanced agriculture, a vast population, and centuries of unbroken civilization behind them. From an economic perspective, China did not depend on Europe nearly as much as Europe depended on China. Britain therefore faced a serious economic problem. Every chest of tea leaving Canton was paid for in silver. Hard currency was hemorrhaging out of British coffers and flooding into China's treasury. Between 1785 and 1830, China's trade surplus over Britain averaged roughly £3 million per year. British silver reserves were draining. The situation was becoming a genuine national crisis, not just for merchants, but for the crown itself. Because if the silver ran out, the tea trade collapsed, and if the tea trade collapsed, Britain lost one of its most important revenue streams, while its industrial working class lost the stimulant that kept them productive. This is the first thing most historians get wrong, or at least understate. They frame the Opium Wars as Britain aggressively choosing to push drugs. But the deeper truth is that Britain was backed into a corner by its own consumption. The opium trade was not simply an expression of strength. It also emerged from Britain's increasingly desperate trade position. Britain was losing the trade war with China badly, and it had no legitimate product that could reverse the bleeding. Every diplomatic attempt to change the terms of trade had failed. Every overture had been rejected, and those rejections were not casual. They were monumental. In 1793, King George III sent one of the most elaborate diplomatic missions in British history to the court of the Qing Emperor. Lord George Macartney sailed to China with a retinue of 95 men, 50 redcoats, and 600 packages of magnificent gifts, including clocks, telescopes, carriages, and scientific instruments. The idea was to dazzle the Chinese court with British innovation, and then negotiate for expanded trade access, a permanent British embassy in Beijing, and reduced tariffs. The mission ended in spectacular failure. Before Macartney even landed, the Chinese hung a banner on his ship that read, in translation, "Tribute bearer from England." When he arrived at the emperor's summer court in Johor, there was an immediate dispute over protocol. Chinese custom required that any foreign emissary perform the kowtow before the emperor, a ritual involving kneeling 3 times and touching one's forehead to the ground 9 times. Macartney refused. He argued that he represented a sovereign equal to the emperor, and he would only bow on one knee as he would before his own king. It was a standoff between 2 entirely different conceptions of global order. The Qianlong Emperor eventually agreed to receive Macartney without the full kowtow, but then he rejected every single one of Britain's requests. Every single one. He famously wrote back to King George III with a letter that has become one of the most quoted documents in imperial history. He told the British king, in essence, that China possessed all things in abundance and had no need for the manufactures of outside barbarians. He said the empire's majestic virtue had penetrated into every country under heaven, and that there was nothing Britain could offer that China did not already have. The letter was courteous and magnificent in tone, but devastating in substance. It was also, in hindsight, a catastrophic miscalculation. Now here's the second thing most historians get wrong. The conventional narrative presents the Macartney mission as a footnote, an amusing diplomatic misfire that preceded the real story. But the Macartney mission was not a footnote. It was the hinge point. Because when diplomacy failed and when legitimate trade could not solve the silver crisis, Britain turned to the one commodity that could, and that commodity was opium. The British East India Company had been growing opium poppies in the Bengal region of India since the 1770s. By 1773, the Governor-General Lord Warren Hastings had brought the entire opium trade under the control of the company itself. Farmers in Bihar and Benares could only cultivate poppies with government licenses. They were paid a fixed, often insultingly low price for their harvest, and faced severe penalties for selling to anyone other than the company's agents. It was, in every meaningful sense, a state-run narcotics operation built on the backs of impoverished Indian peasants. The human cost of this system was enormous. The company's relentless focus on poppy cultivation came at the expense of food crops. Fertile agricultural land was converted to opium production, and when harvests failed, millions went hungry. The Bengal famine of 1770, which killed an estimated 10 million people, was directly connected to the distortion of agriculture under company rule. The regions where the East India Company established its opium agencies remain, to this day, among the most impoverished areas in India, with lower literacy rates, fewer schools, and weaker healthcare infrastructure than neighboring regions. But these Indian victims of the opium trade are rarely mentioned in standard accounts of the Opium Wars. The narrative usually jumps straight from Britain to China, as if the opium materialized from nowhere. The mechanics of the opium trade were deliberately designed to keep the East India Company's hands clean, at least on paper. After 1799, when the Chinese government issued its first serious ban on opium imports, the company stopped shipping opium directly to China. Instead, it auctioned opium at its warehouses in Calcutta to so-called private traders, who were often called country traders, independent British merchants operating under company licenses. These private traders then transported the opium on fast ships to the coast of southern China, where they sold it to Chinese smuggling networks who distributed it inland. This arrangement gave the company a convenient degree of plausible deniability. Officially, they were not smuggling opium into China, they were just growing it and selling it in India. What happened after the auction was officially none of their concern, but everyone knew the truth. The scale revealed by the numbers was staggering. By 1797, the East India Company was selling around 4,000 chests of opium per year to private merchants, each chest weighing roughly 77 kg. By the 1820s, that number had surged to around 10,000 chests per year, and by 1838, it had exploded to approximately 40,000 chests annually. The scale of this operation was not incidental. It was the entire point, because the silver that Chinese opium addicts paid for their drug flowed back through the smuggling networks, through the private traders, and ultimately into the coffers of the East India Company, where it was used to purchase tea for export to Britain. The imperial trade triangle was now complete. Indian opium paid for Chinese tea, which funded the British Treasury, which financed the administration of India, which produced more opium. It was a self-sustaining engine of imperial commerce, and it was breathtakingly cynical. By the 1830s, the opium trade had not only erased Britain's trade deficit with China, it had reversed it entirely. Silver was now flooding out of China and into British pockets. And this is where the real devastation began, because China's economy ran on silver. The Qing government collected taxes in silver. Commerce operated on a bimetallic system where silver and copper circulated together. When silver started hemorrhaging out of the country to pay for opium, the value of silver relative to copper skyrocketed. Ordinary Chinese people, farmers, laborers, small merchants who earned their money in copper coins suddenly found that they needed far more copper to pay their silver-denominated taxes. Between 1829 and 1840, China imported only about $7 million worth of silver, while nearly $56 million worth drained out. Ordinary people were being impoverished by a monetary crisis they had not created and had little power to influence. The drain of silver was devastating entire communities from the inside. And then there was the addiction itself. By the 1830s, opium smoking had spread far beyond the wealthy elite who had originally adopted it as a fashionable pastime. It was now ravaging soldiers, government officials, merchants, laborers, and peasants across southern China. In some coastal regions, addiction rates were catastrophic, with estimates suggesting that up to 90% of the population in certain areas was affected. The Qing military was weakened. The bureaucracy was corrupted. The very foundations of Chinese society were being eaten away. The Qing Emperor was watching his empire crumble from within, and he knew exactly what was causing it. This brings us to the third thing most historians get wrong, and it is perhaps the most important. The conventional narrative presents the immediate cause of the First Opium War as Commissioner Lin Zexu's destruction of British opium in 1839. And technically, that is accurate. But what is almost always missing is the context of why Lin Zexu was sent to Canton in the first place, and what his actions actually represented. Lin Zexu was not a reckless provincial official acting impulsively. He was one of the most respected scholars and administrators in the Qing bureaucracy. He had successfully suppressed opium in multiple provinces before being appointed imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers. When he arrived in Canton in March of 1839, he did not act rashly. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself, and this letter is one of the most remarkable diplomatic documents in history but it is almost never quoted at length in Western accounts. In this letter, Lin appealed to Victoria's sense of morality. He pointed out that Britain itself had laws against opium use domestically, and asked how the Queen could justify allowing her merchants to sell the same poison to Chinese people. He asked whether Victoria would tolerate it if foreign merchants came to Britain and sold deadly drugs to British citizens. He argued that this was not merely a trade dispute, but a question of fundamental human decency. He wrote that there was only self-interest and profits without any regard for human life, and he called that unjust. It was an extraordinary document, a sincere and reasoned appeal from one civilization to another. There remains some question about whether Queen Victoria ever actually read it. She almost certainly did not respond. With no meaningful answer forthcoming, Lin moved to act. He ordered foreign merchants to surrender all their opium stocks and sign pledges never to import opium again under penalty of death. When the merchants stalled, Lin sealed off the foreign factories, a row of warehouse offices along the Pearl River where Western traders were confined under the Canton system. He cut off their food supply and their servants. He trapped them. The British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, eventually convinced the merchants to surrender their opium to him, promising that the British Crown would compensate them. In doing so, Elliot performed a critical legal maneuver that is almost always overlooked. By accepting the opium on behalf of the Crown, he transformed what had been private commercial property into British government property. This meant that when Lin destroyed it, he was no longer destroying the goods of independent merchants. He was destroying property belonging to the British Crown. It was a legal technicality, but one that would become an important pretext for war. Over 23 days in June of 1839, Lin Zexu oversaw the public destruction of more than 20,000 chests of opium, over 1,000 tons of the drug. Workers dissolved it in trenches filled with salt water and lime, then flushed the mixture out to sea. Before the destruction began, Lin reportedly offered a prayer to the spirits of the South China Sea, apologizing for the pollution and asking the creatures of the water to move away for a time to avoid contamination. It was a moment of profound moral clarity, an act of national self-defense against what was, by any honest measure, a campaign of chemical warfare conducted for commercial profit. Back in London, the response was not moral outrage at China's drug problem. It was commercial outrage at the destruction of British property. The merchants who had lost their opium demanded compensation. The hawks in Parliament saw an opportunity to force China open to British trade once and for all. There was actually fierce debate in Parliament about whether going to war was justified. The future Prime Minister, William Gladstone, gave a passionate speech against the war, declaring that the British flag had become a pirate flag to protect an infamous traffic. He condemned the government for starting a war to force an addictive poison on a foreign nation. But Gladstone's side lost. The war faction, led by Lord Palmerston, argued that this was not about opium at all. It was about free trade, national honor, and the rights of British subjects abroad. That framing was deliberate, and politically, it proved effective. By casting the war as a defense of British commercial rights rather than a defense of drug dealing, Parliament authorized military action. And here's the fourth thing most people get wrong. The war itself was not a close fight. It was a massacre. The Qing military was still relying on medieval-era weaponry and tactics. Their war junks were made of wood. Their cannons were centuries out of date. Their soldiers fought with matchlock muskets and swords. The Royal Navy arrived with iron-hulled steamships, modern artillery, and professional marines. In the opening engagement near Hong Kong, the British sank 23 Chinese war junks. The technological gap was not just significant, it was civilizational. China had been the most advanced society on Earth for most of recorded history, but centuries of relative isolation and the Qing court's reluctance to adopt Western military technology had left the empire defenseless against industrial-era warfare. The war lasted roughly 3 years, from 1839 to 1842. and it ended with British warships anchored in the Yangtze River, poised to bombard the city of Nanjing. The Qing government had no choice but to surrender. On August 29, 1842, Chinese and British officials signed the Treaty of Nanjing aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis. The terms imposed on China were devastating. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. It was required to open 5 ports: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai, to unrestricted British trade. It had to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver taels, a staggering sum that further drained the already hemorrhaging treasury, and it had to grant British citizens extraterritorial rights, meaning that British subjects in China would be governed by British law, not Chinese law. The Canton system, the framework through which the Qing dynasty had regulated foreign trade for nearly a century, was dismantled overnight. The Treaty of Nanjing is widely regarded as the first of the so-called unequal treaties, and that term barely captures the scale of the humiliation. These were plainly not negotiations conducted between equal powers. They were terms dictated at gunpoint by a foreign power that had, in effect, fought a war to defend its right to sell drugs. And the Treaty of Nanjing was just the beginning. A supplementary treaty in 1843 granted Britain a most favored nation clause, meaning that any concession China made to any other foreign power would automatically be extended to Britain as well. The Americans and the French quickly piled on, extracting their own treaties with similar terms. China had been cracked open, and every Western power rushed in to take a piece. But the story does not end here, because the settlement of the First Opium War satisfied almost nobody. The British merchants who had hoped for unlimited access to Chinese markets found that the 5 treaty ports did not generate the bonanza they expected. Chinese consumers were still not interested in buying British-manufactured goods. The fundamental trade imbalance that had driven the opium trade in the first place had not been resolved. It had just been temporarily papered over with gunboat diplomacy. China, meanwhile, had been humiliated but was far from completely broken. The Qing government resented the unequal treaties and looked for ways to limit their impact. They dragged their feet on implementation. They restricted access wherever they could. The underlying tensions remained simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a new spark. That spark came in 1856 in the form of an incident so absurd it would be comic if the consequences had not been so tragic. On October 8th of that year, Qing officials boarded a ship called the Arrow in Canton Harbor. The Arrow was a Chinese-owned vessel that had previously been registered under the British flag, a practice that was common at the time and gave ships a degree of protection from Chinese authorities. The officials arrested 12 Chinese crew members on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. The British consul, Harry Parkes, immediately protested, claiming that the boarding was an insult to the British flag. There was just one problem. The Arrow's British registration had actually expired. The legal basis for Britain's outrage was, to put it charitably, extremely thin. But the legal merits did not matter. Britain wanted another war. The first one had not gone far enough. Lord Palmerston, now Prime Minister, saw the Arrow incident as the pretext he needed to force even more concessions from China. French joined in, using the murder of a French missionary named Auguste Chapdelaine in Guangxi province as their own justification. The Second Opium War had begun. For China, the timing could hardly have been worse. The Qing dynasty was already reeling from the Taiping Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising that had erupted in 1850 and would eventually claim an estimated 20 to 30 million lives, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Some scholars put the death toll even higher, at potentially 100 million when accounting for the famine and disease that followed. The rebellion was led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service examinee who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ and sought to establish a heavenly kingdom on Chinese soil. The Taiping rebels had nearly captured Beijing and still controlled vast stretches of southern China. The Qing court was fighting for its very survival against internal enemies, while simultaneously facing the combined military might of Britain and France from the outside. The Second Opium War unfolded in two phases. In the first, Anglo-French forces captured Canton in late 1857 and then sailed north to seize the Taku forts near Tianjin, forcing the Qing to negotiate. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 opened 10 more ports to foreign trade, allowed foreign diplomats to reside in Beijing for the first time, legalized the importation of opium, and permitted Christian missionaries to travel freely in the Chinese interior. But then, the Qing government refused to ratify the treaty. The emperor's court could not bring itself to accept the humiliation. Hostilities resumed. In 1860, British and French troops marched on Beijing itself. The Xianfeng emperor fled the capital, and then came one of the most wantonly destructive acts of the entire 19th century. On the orders of Lord Elgin, British forces looted and burned the old summer palace, a vast complex of palaces, gardens, pavilions, and art collections that had taken over a century to build. The palace housed priceless works of art, rare manuscripts, gold and silver treasures, and cultural artifacts spanning dynasties. The destruction continued for 2 days. The French, who had participated enthusiastically in the looting, actually refused to help with the burning. But the destruction was carried out regardless. Lord Elgin later justified the act by claiming it was retaliation for the torture and murder of British and French envoys who had been captured during negotiations. But the burning of the Summer Palace was something more than retaliation. It was a message. It told the Qing court and the entire world that no nation could resist British power without consequences. It was cultural annihilation as a tool of statecraft. The Convention of Peking in 1860 formally ended the Second Opium War. China ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, adding it to the Hong Kong colony. It paid another massive indemnity. Russia, which had mediated the peace, extracted its own reward, gaining vast territories in outer Manchuria, including the land where Vladivostok stands today. The opium trade was fully legalized. China's sovereignty had been severely compromised. And this brings us to the fifth and perhaps most consequential thing that the standard narrative gets wrong. The Opium Wars are almost always taught as a self-contained episode, a chapter that opens with the trade deficit and closes with the unequal treaties. But the Opium Wars were not an episode. They were the opening act of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation, a period stretching from 1839 to 1949, during which China was systematically exploited by foreign powers, stripped of territory, drained of wealth, and torn apart by internal rebellions. The psychological wound of this period is not historical for China. It is alive. It is present. It shapes Chinese foreign policy, military strategy, and diplomatic posture to this very day. The First Opium War did not just open 5 treaty ports. It shattered the Qing dynasty's legitimacy. For millennia, the emperor's mandate to rule was based on the idea that he maintained harmony between heaven and earth. Military defeat by foreign barbarians called that mandate into question. The internal rebellions that followed, the Taiping Rebellion, the Nian Rebellion, the Dungan Revolt, were not separate from the Opium Wars. They were consequences of them. The massive indemnities demanded by the unequal treaties bankrupted the Qing treasury, which meant higher taxes on an already impoverished peasantry, which fueled the resentment that exploded into revolt. The silver drain caused by the opium trade destabilized the currency, which destabilized commerce, which destabilized society. It was a cascading failure, and the Opium Wars were the first domino. There's another dimension to this story that is almost never discussed, and it connects the Opium Wars to the broader story of global capitalism. The East India Company was far more than an ordinary trading enterprise. It was the world's first multinational corporation with a private army. At its peak, the company's military forces were larger than the British Army itself. It governed tens of millions of people in India. It set tax rates. It administered justice. It waged wars. And the opium trade was the keystone of its entire financial structure. The revenues from opium auctions in Calcutta funded the company's military operations in India, which secured the territory where the opium was grown, which generated the revenue that funded the military operations. Remove opium from this equation, and the entire architecture of British India would have been in serious jeopardy. This is what makes the Opium Wars so much more than a bilateral dispute between Britain and China. They were the moment when the logic of global capitalism, the relentless pursuit of profit margins and favorable trade balances collided head-on with the sovereignty of a civilization that refused to play by European rules, and capitalism won. Not because its arguments were stronger, but because its warships were. The individuals who profited from this trade are worth examining as well because they reveal something uncomfortable about the foundations of modern Western wealth. Many of the private traders who transported opium to China became fabulously wealthy and went on to found institutions that are still influential today. The Jardine Matheson Company, originally one of the most aggressive opium trading firms in Canton, still exists as a massive conglomerate headquartered in Hong Kong. The American opium trade, though smaller than the British one, also produced fortunes. Warren Delano Jr., an American merchant who made his money smuggling opium into China, was the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States. The Forbes family of Boston accumulated significant wealth through the opium trade. These connections are not merely obscure historical footnotes. These are the direct genealogies of power in the modern world, and the drug money at their roots is rarely acknowledged. The Rothschilds, who you may remember from other stories of imperial finance, were also connected to the broader network that sustained the opium economy. The banking infrastructure that financed the East India Company's operations, the insurance companies that underwrote the voyages, the shipping firms that built and maintained the opium clippers, all of these were part of an interconnected system of imperial capital that reached into every corner of the British establishment. When we talk about old money in the Western world, we are often, whether we realize it or not, talking about money that passed through the opium trade on its way to respectability. Now, it would be dishonest to present this story without also examining China's role in its own vulnerability. The Qing dynasty was not merely a passive victim of outside aggression. It was an aging empire with deep structural problems that predated the Opium Wars. The Canton system itself, while designed to protect Chinese sovereignty, was also deeply corrupt. The Kohong merchants who served as intermediaries between foreign traders and the Qing government were often in debt. The Hapo, the imperial superintendent of maritime customs, routinely skimmed enormous sums that flowed into the imperial household rather than the national treasury. The annual income from Canton's foreign trade, which could reach up to 855,000 silver taels, went directly into the pockets of the imperial clan rather than being used for national defense or infrastructure. This corruption weakened China's ability to enforce its own laws, including its bans on opium. The Qing military's technological stagnation was also not simply bad luck. It was a choice, or rather the result of an institutional culture that valued classical learning, Confucian philosophy, and the maintenance of social harmony over technological innovation and military modernization. When the Macartney mission arrived in 1793 with its clocks and telescopes and carriages, the Qianlong emperor dismissed them as clever toys from a lesser civilization. That dismissal was not irrational given the context of Chinese history and culture, but it was fatal in an era when European military technology was advancing at an exponential rate. The gap between a Chinese war junk and a British iron-hulled steamship was not just a gap in engineering. It was a gap in civilizational priorities that would take China nearly 2 centuries to close. There is also the matter of internal Chinese debate about how to handle the opium crisis, which is far more nuanced than most accounts acknowledge. Before Lin Zexu was sent to Canton, there was a serious policy debate within the Qing court. One faction, known as the legalization camp, argued that opium should be legalized and taxed, which would generate revenue for the government and eliminate the black market. They pointed out that prohibition was clearly not working, and that the smuggling networks were enriching corrupt officials while the government got nothing. The opposing faction, the prohibition camp, argued that legalization would only accelerate the spread of addiction and that the moral and social costs were too high to accept. Lin Zexu was the leading voice of the prohibition camp, and his appointment as imperial commissioner represented the triumph of that position. But the existence of the internal debate reveals that the Qing court was not simply reacting blindly. Officials at the highest levels understood the economic dimensions of the crisis and were actively searching for solutions. What makes the Opium Wars truly tragic is not just the violence or the exploitation, but the fact that the collision was in many ways avoidable. If the Qianlong Emperor had agreed to even modest trade reforms during the Macartney mission, the economic pressure that drove the opium trade might have been reduced. If the East India Company had been willing to accept a slower, more balanced approach to trade rather than demanding unlimited access, the confrontation might have been delayed or avoided. If the British Parliament had listened to Gladstone and the anti-war faction rather than Palmerston and the Hawks, the first shots might never have been fired. But none of these alternatives came to pass because on both sides, short-term interests and institutional inertia overwhelmed the possibility of compromise. The legacy of the Opium Wars extends far beyond the 19th century. When Hong Kong was finally returned to China in 1997, 155 years after the Treaty of Nanjing, it was widely understood in China as the closing of a wound that had been open since 1842. The ceremony was not just a diplomatic formality, it was a moment of national catharsis, the symbolic end of the century of humiliation. But even that closure was incomplete, because the deeper legacy of the Opium Wars is not territorial. Its deepest dimension is psychological. The lesson that China drew from the Opium Wars, the lesson that is still taught in every Chinese school today, is that weakness invites aggression. If you are backward, you will take a beating. This conviction drives China's massive military modernization, its relentless economic growth, its determination to never again be in a position where a foreign power can dictate terms at gunpoint. There is an uncomfortable irony in the modern relationship between China and the Western world that connects directly back to the Opium Wars. Today, the flow of addictive substances has reversed direction. Synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl and its chemical precursors, are manufactured in China and shipped to the United States, where they fuel an addiction crisis that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. Some scholars have noted the parallel and suggested that China's reluctance to aggressively crack down on fentanyl exports carries a whiff of historical payback, a reversal of the dynamic that devastated China 2 centuries ago. Whether that interpretation is justified remains debatable, but the structural parallel is undeniable, and it reveals something profound about the long shadow of imperial exploitation. So, what do historians actually get wrong about the Opium Wars? They get several things wrong. First, they reduce the story to a moral fable about drugs when it was really about the architecture of global trade and the fundamental incompatibility of two economic worldviews. Second, they understate Britain's desperation, presenting the opium trade as an act of predatory strength when it was actually an act of strategic necessity born from a losing trade position. Third, they erase the Indian victims entirely, the millions of farmers who were coerced into growing poppies and suffered famine and poverty so that the East India Company could maintain its profit margins. Fourth, they treat the Opium Wars as a discrete historical event, rather than as the first act of a century-long unraveling that reshaped Asia and continues to shape geopolitics today. And fifth, they fail to connect the profits of the opium trade to the foundations of modern Western wealth, treating the drug money as something that disappeared into the past rather than something that was laundered through generations of investment, philanthropy and institution building into the respectable fortunes that still wield influence. The deeper origins of the Opium Wars cannot be reduced to opium alone. It was tea, silver, civilizational pride, imperial desperation, and the cold arithmetic of a global trade system that valued profit over human life. Opium was the mechanism through which those deeper pressures operated. The real engine was the relentless logic of empire, the same logic that drove the East India Company, that built Standard Oil, that fueled the scramble for Africa, and that continues to shape the distribution of wealth and power across the planet. Understanding this history is more than an academic exercise. It is essential for understanding the world we live in right now, because the forces that started the Opium Wars, the trade imbalances, the strategic dependencies, the willingness to sacrifice human welfare for economic advantage, these forces have not disappeared. They have simply taken different forms. If you made it to the end of this one, leave a teacup emoji in the comments. I would love to see how many of you stayed through the full story. And if you found value in this kind of deep dive, please subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you might think. I have got more stories like this one coming, stories about the hidden mechanics behind the events that shaped our world. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.